Well, hello and welcome to Beaverdale Books. As baseball season begins, it's only fitting to take a look back at the game's colorful past and its rich history in the city of St. Louis, where three major professional teams, the St. Louis Cardinals, Browns, and/or Stars, called home. But before we begin tonight's program, please indulge me just a bit so I can highlight the plethora of events that we will be part of in the coming month. April is Poetry Month, and we kick it off next Monday with Tracy Brimhall and Chipozie Obiama. And then on Tuesday, we have a wonderful event featuring Lillian O'Keefe and her story of coming to America from Uganda. Then we will be part of the Poetry Palooza. Get the right one here. And that is scheduled for April 6th through 7th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And it kicks off with a poetry slam at Franklin Junior High on the 6th. Everything's free. Then on Friday, we take over Mainframe Studios, and we will have 4 floors of poets, including 4 state poets laureate. So if you enjoy poetry at all, there will be something there for you. And then Saturday morning, it's all poetry workshops. So if you want information about that, it's poetryamp.org. And we have these up at the desk. Again, this is our inaugural event, and we really expect it to be a phenomenal program. Then, of course, there is the library's Avid Author Series, and we are at all of those, and we sell books there. And then we have a ton of in-store events just like tonight's, and you can pick up a flyer like that. That is just April, so you can see we've got a lot going on. And be sure to visit our website or our Facebook page. We will be filming this for Facebook Live, and we do that with most of our events. So if there's an event you can't get to, check it out on our Facebook page, and we leave those up for about 30 days. So if you miss one, just go to Facebook. All right, that's the end of the commercial. I am the marketing person, if you couldn't tell. Chris Moeller's book, The St. Louis Baseball Mosaic, does double and triple duty as a lighthearted personal memoir of the author and as a 20th century entertainment history for the city of St. Louis. Highlighted biographies include Ernie Orsatti, the Hollywood stuntman and one-time stand-in for Buster Keaton, who graduated from the motion picture business to become the primary center fielder for the Cardinals' famous Gas House Gang of the 1930s. And Helene Robinson Britton, the first female owner of any team in the major North American professional sports leagues. Better known baseball stars and personalities of the Mound City are also included, like Cooperstown Hall of Famers Branch Rickey, Dizzy Dean, Ozzie Smith, Cool Papa Bell, Yogi Berra, Bob Gibson, and the dynamic duo of Bill Veeck and Satchel Paige. Chris is a veteran of both the radio and financial services in Des Moines. A lifelong Iowan, he's a 1997 graduate of the journalism and mass communication program at Iowa State, go Sun Books, and the author of a previous book. He lives on the near north side of Des Moines with his partner Jesse and his cat Nola. I'm coming wrong. But tonight we are also pleased to have John Liepa join us as a moderator. John is Professor Emeritus of History and Political Science at Des Moines Area Community College and a lifelong baseball card collector. He owns an extensive collection of cards and memorabilia representing Iowa's 222 major leaguers, featuring Iowa's 7 Hall of Famers. Over the past years, he has done more than 188 had to update that, presentations on baseball history throughout Iowa, often appearing as Montrose, Iowa's Calvin McVeigh, Iowa's first professional baseball player who played for America's first all-professional baseball team, the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. John lives in West Des Moines with his wife Diane. So now please join me in welcoming Chris and John. Take it away.
Thank you. I want to add just a little bit to what Jan said. And first of all, I want to thank Jan of Beaverdale Books for doing this. She also hosted a book signing for Steve Dunn, who's not with us tonight. But Steve is a longtime friend, was a sports writer for the Keokuk paper, moved to Des Moines a few years ago. He ushers down at the I-Cubs, and he wrote a short history of the Iowa Cubs. And you know, that was the last time I was here for his book signing. And but I told Jan as you guys were arriving that I do have a door prize, and I don't need a commitment right away, but I've been about a 30-year supporter of the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, and there are different level clubs and so on. But anyway, they give me every year 2 tickets to the induction ceremony for the Hall of Fame inductees. And I've shared them with other friends when I can't go. I've been able to share them with 5 or 6 different friends. So, first come, first serve. If anybody wants to go to the Hall of Fame in late July, I have 2 tickets. There's reserved parking. Remember, Chris has been there. And remember, this is a town of normally about 2,000 people that 50,000 people come to for the Hall of Fame induction. And they've got a seat for you and a place to park your car. And so, but you have to pay your own way out there and for the hotel and everything else. But I have them available. So, and I can leave all the contact information. Jan has it and so on. Chris does too, so you guys can. But what I want to do as a way of introducing the book and talking about Chris a little bit is today was opening day, as you all know. And you can tell that I am a lifelong Yankee fan. I grew up not far from here. I, with 3 brothers, had newspaper routes near Monroe School on 30th and Hickman. And back in the 1950s, 2 older brothers, 1 younger brother, we spent most of our profits from those newspaper routes on baseball cards, comic books, football cards, basketball cards. And I had complete sets from the 50s, starting with 52 Tops and Bowman and on through the 50s. And I've heard the sob story so many times when I do presentations about mother threw my cards out. Always mom, never dad. But anyway, my mom didn't. And so I really didn't ever stop. I put it on pause, had to pay my way through college and everything like that. But I have 2 kids, now 5 grandchildren and so on. And baseball has been part of that. We took our kids to games and so on. But anyway, what I had to look up today, Steve Ellsbury, who's a huge Giants fan, is not with us tonight. Some of you know Steve, but bear with me here for a second because I want to read something to you first of all. The exit velocity was 109.3 miles per hour. The launch angle was 28 degrees. The height was 100 feet. The distance was 422 feet. The wall distance was 409 feet. That was Aaron Judge's home run today as the Yankees beat the Giants, Steve's team, 5-0. And what even made it better is when they renewed the contract for Aaron Judge, the Giants tried to buy him, and so did the Padres. And Aaron Judge everything is good about baseball. You can find plenty of things to criticize, but Aaron he's a great young man, early 30s and so on, breaking records left and right. And follow that up with another incredible event that all baseball nerds will never forget. At the World Baseball Congress, what was the last event at the Congress? You had the best all-around player in baseball, Ohtani, pitching against the best batter in baseball, Trout, teammates. It goes to a 3-2 count, and he strikes them out. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that if you're a baseball fan. But the reason I read the Judge statistics to you is that you won't find much of that in Chris's book. All right. And I'm not anti-sabermetrics, I'm not anti-analytics and so on. I understand that, but what baseball's come down to, I wrote an article about a great scout from Cedar Rapids named Cy Slapnicka. And he discovered Bob Feller, he discovered over 30 major league players, including a number of Iowans. And what he said is that the game has come down to either that it's scoring or scouting. And he broke it down that a lot of these scouts, they don't need to know the name of the player. They need to know nothing about his character. All they look at are the numbers. And that's the scoring side of it. The scouting is find out about his dad and mom, find out about his background, his family, and so on. And I'm maybe a little bit old-fashioned, but I think that speaks volumes about sort of a divide in the game of baseball today. And I point that out to you as a way to introduce. The name of the book is the St. Louis Baseball Mosaic. And, I met Chris for the first time. I think I've heard him over the years at KX now, and I'm sure we bumped into each other at the beer line at the iCubs or something like that. But I hadn't really met him or had a chance to talk with him, you know, until a few weeks ago, that day where they predicted 3 inches of snow. And we're sitting in Perkins out on 86th and Dickman, and keep looking out the window. There's nobody else in the restaurant, and we're up to 6 inches, 7 inches. And I sort of said, "How far do you live from here?" And I live pretty close, so. But anyway, we had a good hour and a half meeting, and then we were invited to by John Busby at the radio station down in Mainframe Studios to come down there and talk about his book and about this program and so on. And but what I like about the book is that there are 10 chapters, and they're just, each one can be looked at and read and enjoyed independently of each other. And since I've had the book for the last 4 or 5 years, I just finished reading my 5th chapter. But I encourage all of you, before you read the book, read his introduction, because the first question I'm going to have him answer here in a second is, I want to know more about the motivation for writing the book. Any of us that have been around baseball for a long time could write our own book, but we don't. You know, I've written a lot of articles, Iowa History Journal, Iowa Heritage Illustrated, but I've never either taken the time, had the incentive, whatever, to put together a book. I have enough material for probably 10 books, but I just haven't done it. He did it, and he did it in a great way. I like the word mosaic, because as Jan said in the introduction, St. Louis is about great players that played in the Negro Leagues. And, you know, and he touches on that all the time, whether it's Satchel Paige, you know, Cool Papa Bell, whoever it might be. The first chapter is on Cool Papa Bell. And then he's got a couple of chapters. My wife shares a birth date with Stan Musial, and I've met Stan a number of times. And he personalized a poster, you know, to my wife and so on. Her name is Diane. And that hung in her office for years. And it was an icebreaker when people came in. Whatever they had to talk about, they didn't want to talk about. They wanted to talk about that poster on the wall. And so there's a chapter on Musial. There's another Iowa tie. Ozzie Smith met a number of years with the Clarinda Cardinals. Today is part of the Mink League. And I've done the program down there. And Bud Epperly and his wife, they are second parents to Ozzie Smith. And he's never forgotten that. And he was there at the induction ceremony when Ozzie Smith was inducted. And that's kind of funny in and of itself, reading about getting there, where they stayed, and so on. And then the last one I just finished reading this afternoon is about a team that almost everybody's forgotten was a major league team, because they were losers. They only went to the World Series once, and David knows that. But the St. Louis Browns, they had so many colorful characters on that team. But anyway, so you can pick up the book, read a chapter, put it down, come back to it. But what I want to do is I want to start out by asking Chris about how did he get from, you know, every important date in his life, his brother's life, parents' lives. He remembers by tying it to an important date in St. Louis baseball life. And he didn't get a job as an usher when he wanted one down there, but he sold ice cream. And I've been to St. Louis many, many times, to ball games, to a variety of things down there, a National Baseball Convention and so on. But he knows every street in St. Louis. He knows every historic building. And as a historian, I like that he ties in a lot of history in that book, along with, it's not just baseball, it's much more than baseball. It's you know, black-white relations, it's labor management relations, it's poor-rich relations, it's a lot of other things other than baseball. And funny stories, some that I had heard, some that I had never heard. This afternoon, I couldn't stop laughing when I read some of the stuff about the Browns, and I knew some of it. So, Chris, you take it from here. How did it go from a lifetime of, you know, baseball trivia to a book?
It was, well, the pandemic helped somewhat. It put me at home. And then I started looking at on eBay for certain collectibles. It was very easy. They make it really easy by just hitting a button, and something's at your front door 2 days later, and you're stuck in that home. And you're sort of starting to decorate a house that's oversized and very old. And there's a lot of space, and you start looking around the corner and you think something extra could probably go on that shelf right over there. And so you start thinking of that. And one item, I started looking for items that just didn't exist anywhere else. And it's chapter 7 in this book, this concept that I would center each history around a specific artifact. And it was a letter, a very brief letter, that the great Cardinal pitcher Bob Gibson wrote to Arthur Richmond, who's a very unusual character, who's kind of like a Forrest Gump character, and that he always seems to be around these various things that have happened in baseball history, a New Yorker. And he worked for the Mets and Yankees forever and was apparently good friends with Bob Gibson. And Bob Gibson just sent him a risque greeting card at one point, and I just figured I'll buy that. And because it came with the envelope, it came with a little scratch piece of paper that was him writing, thought of you, and I can't remember the line, I thought of you and I saw this or whatever. And he signed his name on it. I like to think it's the smallest Bob Gibson signature that exists anywhere, because it's very small on the top. And I thought the idea, well, there's so many things like this that you could take this and go with it. The artifacts are an excuse to tell stories. Every chapter, I just thought if I could think of any story that I've heard or collected over time, we all have them, just throw it in there. And maybe you heard it differently, but the way you heard it is wrong. It's slightly off. The way I heard it is right. I talked to some publishers on this that wanted more sourcing that I wanted to do, and I didn't think they understood what I was doing. It's sort of myth and folklore in some cases, and maybe I have it completely wrong in some cases, although I did do bibliographies on each chapter. But the idea that you could sort of source what Dizzy Dean said when he got hit in the head in game 3 of the 1934 World Series, running the bases and got knocked out, even the next morning. This was an era of very unreliable newspaper reporting. Anyway, you had stories, prominent newspapers said he was out like a mackerel, was one of the lines. And then, but his brother Paul said he was there. He never lost consciousness. They said he was talking, and they said to Paul, "What was he saying?" And Paul said, "Nothing, just talking." And that was as we recognize Dizzy Dean. So the idea of putting the stories down, that was the big thing, and I guess that was the most immediate thing that got me thinking you could write something that was colorful and entertaining, I suppose. And centering it around St. Louis, I love the city. As much as writing about baseball, I always kind of love the idea of the energy of the city. When Jesse and I go places, we make sure we ride, public transportation in New York, Chicago, St. Louis on the Metrolink, and just sort of take in the vibe that way. And I always think when I go to these places, when I read nonfiction, everyone in this room reads and enjoys nonfiction, you still want to escape in that same way that you do with fiction literature. But I want to sort of get in the book, and if they ever mentions a street corner, a street address, I go to my phone now and I map it. I want to see if it's there, whatever it is. I want to see what is there now, if it's something and it's like as soon as I get into the book, I immediately want to get out of the book and get to where that actually is. So I didn't hold back. Any place I could put an address, the restaurant, the hotel, the person that used to live there might be long gone and from that location and long dead, but it's what's there now. That's just fascinating to me. And so I didn't skimp on addresses. And I said in the introduction of the book, one of the things I said, if you live in St. Louis or if you travel there often, it fits on a shelf, but you can also put it behind the passenger side seat and keep it in the car, because when you're going around, you might come across these things. Even if something is long gone, it's something else is there now, and the ghost of that, whatever, is still there. That's the beauty of history, I think, in celebrating it.
So how long did it take you to actually put the book together?
The whole spine was in place within 3 or 4 months, and then you can sort of tinker with it forever and ever and ever, and I still read it now. I was rereading it again in preparation for this, just to sort of have it fresh with me, and you read 1,000 things I wish I could still add, not necessarily change, but there's a reference to a television show or a movie or something like that too, or some piece that's even outside of baseball though that would add good color to it.
I think one of the things in the book that it's surprising and like I said, it's funny, but I forget who the player was, but who was it? Joe Berardino, who ended up as a star in General Hospital. And he's got this detailed, description of his role, all the years of that soap opera running.
I forgot about that.
That was just, nobody knows who he was as a ball player. If you watch soap operas.
Gentleman's name was Johnny Berardino, and he played for the Cleveland Indians and then the St. Louis Browns in the late 40s. And I have a baseball card of him, a Bowman card, because he's one of my favorites. And Berardino went into acting. You can see him apparently as an extra in both North by Northwest and North by Northwest is what I'm thinking of. And but then he was on General Hospital. He's Dr. Steve somebody for the first 30 years of that show. He was like one of the principal stars of it. So just as a flourish, I decided to put a paragraph in there where I just said he had an eventful 30 years, and I found online where it put everything that happened to this character, Dr. Steve, in 30 years.
And I've got
Which is a lot. The guy had a tough life. He really did.
I mentioned that I read this afternoon the chapter on the Browns, and I had heard of him, but boy, this whole new world opened up, and not a good one. Blackie Schwam for the Browns. Tell him a little bit about this character.
Blackie got his nickname because of that was his most common mood. He was drummed out of the military right after World War II. He was supposed to be on a boat that sank and wasn't on it, but then got arrested for desertion. Got set loose. He was a Los Angeles pitcher with an incredible arm. They said at the time he was a Bob Feller type arm. To put it in, that great Iowa pitcher is, of course, the standard really for all time for velocity. I'm not just using it because he's an Iowan. But he was put in that category, Ralph Blackie Schwam. But he was tied into the rackets, the Mickey Cohen rackets in Los Angeles. If you're familiar with I think the best would be the movie L.A. Confidential, which takes place at exactly the same time. He could be one of those hoods. In the same time period. 1948 was when he pitched with the Browns. And I was fascinated with this guy because he wound up getting up to the Browns, but drinking the entire time. He was already a very heavy drinker. He had been a collector of gambling debts for Mickey Cohen in Los Angeles, and that paid a lot better than baseball did and that the Browns did in the 40s. So even after he had pitched with the Browns, and it was only 8 games, I was so fascinated with this guy, I gave him like 1 page for almost every game he pitched. But Blackie wound up, I'll leave it to the book, but he wound up being arrested for murder, and he went away to San Quentin in California, but is considered to be the greatest prison yard pitcher of all time. And somebody has gathered the statistics to figure out, because it's in the San Francisco Recreational League, and apparently all the San Francisco baseball amateur teams in the 40s wanted, I'm sure for some fun, to get the San Quentin All-Stars on their schedule, and there was a tremendous amount. And so he would pitch against all these teams in the San Francisco Rec League. And by the way, they played all home games, the San Quentin All-Stars. And somebody would hit a foul ball out of the prison, and the prisoners would say, "I wish I was that ball." But anyway, so he was considered the greatest prison yard pitcher of all time. There was a very good book written about him before I put a few pages in there. And he was not the first former major league player to play for the San Quentin All-Stars. The first one was a gentleman named Red Downs, who is from Iowa.
Neola, Iowa produced 2 major league players. Red Morgan, Red Downs, both born in 1883. And Red Downs, just like Blackie, has some difficulties with the law.
That was armed robbery or bank robbery.
Yeah. So I knew that, when we met and we talked, I realized that we did share a lot in common. Jan's introduction is that I was involved with a little bit peripherally with the final season, the movie about Norway, Iowa. And in the year 2006, we hosted a baseball symposium at the Hoover Museum and Library. And we had a number of former players there. Bobby Oldest of the Pirates was there, and Bruce Kim was there, who managed the Iowa Cubs and so on. We had Don Denkinger there, who was an umpire from Waterloo.
Cardinal fans know who that is.
Yeah, right. And Art Pennington, who had a nickname Superman and played in the Negro Leagues. But we also had the cast of the movie there. And Jim Van Scoyk, who was the final, well, second to last manager for the Norway team, he was there, and I've gotten to know him a little bit. And then, of course, as he told me a little bit more about himself, I realized we both did time at Iowa State. I did a lot earlier than he did, Chris did. But what I love about the book, and the reason I'm pulling out a couple of these names, most people have never heard of them. And they have interesting stories to tell, whether they're good, bad, or somewhere in between. And I did read a book a few years ago, and this is my next question. And I don't remember the exact title, but it's something, The Diz, Rapid, Robert, and Satch. And it came out maybe 7 or 8 years ago about Dizzy Dean, Satchel Paige, and Bob Feller. And he goes into quite a bit of detail about, obviously, 2 of those characters. Satchel Paige, in one of the chapters that deals with the Negro Leagues and so on. And of course, with Dizzy Dean. And what I wanted to ask you a little bit is, Dizzy Dean, like Yogi Berra, like Satchel Paige, I often tell audiences that the 2 other major sports, basketball and football, have nothing comparable to baseball when it comes to people that are wired differently up here. Casey Stengel, Satchel Paige, Yogi Berra, they think and speak totally differently. And you had some great lines from Dizzy Dean and some stories about Dizzy. I want to share a couple of them.
There was one as a broadcaster where I'd have to think it through to get it right, but he says he had a hard time focusing on the game as a broadcaster, apparently, and could be distracted by a hot dog wrapper blowing across the field, for example. He would describe that. But one of the lines was he was looking into the stands, and Harry Carey used to do this for both Cardinals and Cubs fans, know Harry well. And that he would be especially you get distracted also looking around. The conversational pace of the game of baseball allows you time to look around. And looking into the stands, and he saw a young couple making out there on their seats. And his line was, "Look at that couple over there." This is a paraphrase. "Look at that couple over there. They're really making out. I can see what they do. He kisses her on the strikes, and she kisses him on the balls." That was.
I told you it's funny.
At what point can we ask questions or comment?
Yeah.
Because when you talk about,
I didn't know how Jan wanted to run this. Yeah. Anytime you want questions.
Yeah, maybe repeat the questions for Facebook.
I just have to comment.
Go ahead.
When you're talking about Dizzy Dean, I grew up a Cardinal fan. I have not been paying attention to baseball in many years, but I'm still a Cardinal fan. But I just imagine Harry Carey telling those stories that you wrote about of Dizzy Dean. Telling the story about him getting hit on the head as he made a late slide. It just all came alive, and I just sat there and laughed. I mean, it was just so wonderful.
I devoted some time to Harry Carey in a chapter that was about. There's a couple chapters that are more about landmarks and about principal characters. One is the Stan Musial and Biggie's restaurant or steakhouse. That was open for a good 40-some years at 2 locations in St. Louis, and that sort of stands in as a substitute for a biography of Musial, the player. But another one is about the Chase Park Plaza Hotel, which I had because I've just read so many St. Louis history books, baseball books, but not baseball books, too, over the years, that just kept constantly referencing this Chase Hotel. I had never stayed there, but going back to the 20s, the first part of that opened. And so I just started finding an extraordinary number of things that were connected to the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. And one was Harry Carey being hit by a car right out in front of the hotel on Kings Highway in 1968, which was kind of the beginning of the end for Harry in St. Louis. He was only with the Cardinals through the '69 season, and then he was fired by Gussie Busch for rumored relationships within the Busch family, and which he never denied, because he said, "I never looked like Robert Redford, so why would I deny these rumors?" But he had been hit by the car out in front. That's where that had taken place, Jack Buck was also drinking at the Chase Club, which is the bar inside the restaurant. when he got on a payphone and talked to apparently who was his the woman who was his mistress in 1968, same year as the accident, and told him that she was pregnant with his child. And he left his wife and 6 children. He married Carol, the second wife, and the child that was born is Joe Buck, who's then, of course, broadcast 25 World Series, whatever it is, and 6 Super Bowls, whatever that is. That happened outside the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. But that's where I put the Harry stuff and a bunch of stuff about Harry, because that's obviously an extraordinary character that everybody in the Midwest can share in a sense, because the Cubs and the Cardinals sharing him, and the White Sox as well. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Anyone else a question at this point? We can continue here, but anyone else? In my comments early on, I said that had to be one of the highlights of your life was going to Ozzie Smith's induction ceremony. Can you talk a little bit more to our audience about that? You're going out there, and it's funny. It's you could see it meant a lot to you. Obviously.
Oh, thank you. It does. That's the only part of the book. There's 10 chapters. Like I said, one's on a hotel. There's 9 principal characters, and 8 of them are dead. The other one is Ozzie Smith. So I gave him the last chapter, and he's so many Cardinal of my generation, but older and younger, he's our favorite Cardinal. And so it was kind of determined by a friend and I years before, and my twin brother who's sitting over here went too, even though he's a Cincinnati Reds fan. He was gracious enough to go with us on a road trip down the Yellow Brick Interstate to see the Wizard of Oz be inducted into Cooperstown in 2002. We did go there. It is very difficult to find housing there, as you said, for a short amount of time that weekend. We had been there once before. It's easy the rest of the year, but if you're there on induction weekend, I didn't realize until the time that people make a day of it. It's primarily New York City residents who can drive up somewhat easily, or stay not far away. And we stayed at a KOA campground, which even that had been booked. They know in advance when the ceremony is going to be. So you really got to book out in advance and hope your guy gets in if he's first ballot or second ballot or whatever it is. And we were pretty sure Ozzie would get in. But that was still the best we could do. We stayed at a KOA campground with very few facilities. It's middle of July, but I will tell you it's colder in upstate New York in July than I thought it would be. And so we did that when we were there. And he gave a great speech. He was the one and only inductee that year, except for, of course, the Broadcasting Award and the Writing Award. But he gave what I think has to be the greatest Hall of Fame speech at all. It had props. He came out in the big, giant afro wig that sort of commemorated his appearance when he was with the San Diego Padres in the late 70s and made some of his famous highlight reel plays. He had Wizard of Oz music that came up at the end. He had props that were a baseball that and he sort of cut between baseball and the Wizard. His speech sort of involved the brains, help me out, the brains, the courage, and the
Heart.
Thank you, the heart. That's the one I always have trouble with.
Yeah.
I know. I can never remember that one. But he gave a terrific speech. So.
A book that I would recommend, I don't know if you have it, Jim, but if you've never read The Baseball Whisperer, and I think the author is Tackett, his son played for the Clarinda Cardinals and was one of those 42 major leaguers have gone through Clarinda, Iowa, including Ozzie. And Ozzie, basically it was one couple that over a 50-year period got homes to provide for these ball players. It's just a wonderful. They have a reunion every year at dinner, and 200 people show up for that, including a lot of the players. And Ozzie was religious about coming back. He felt he owed so much to Bud Epperly and his wife, and they were in the front row for the induction ceremony.
And mentioned in the speech as well.
Yeah, and they were mentioned in the speech. So
as a second set of parents, really.
Yeah. Question. Go ahead, ma'am.
When did he start doing backflips and that sort of thing? Did he do those in Clarinda?
He did it. The way he has told the story, this isn't the book. The way he's told this story is that there was a Padres teammate named Gene Tennis who wound up playing with him with the Cardinals with the '82 World Series champions, who had two girls who were in gymnastics, and he did it, and they had the idea for him to do it, and I think he did it for the first time as a Cardinal in the 1982 World Series. I know he does it before Game 7, and you can see it on YouTube. They don't show it, but because it seems to have taken NBC by surprise that he has done it. But the announcers, if you watch the video, the announcers are alluding to the fact that he's done it. And then, of course, by the time they returned to the World Series in '85 and then again in '87 with Ozzie as the center of the team, he was doing it on opening day, always, and then before each game. And he says that's what everybody remembers about him. Of course, that's the number one thing. I've heard him say that several times, so in interviews.
When I first, heard about Calvin McVeigh, the Iowa kid that was on the Cincinnati Red Stockings, I was doing research, reading some newspaper accounts, and he played for the University 9 in Indianapolis, but he talked about his childhood in Montrose, 6 miles north of Keokuk, and they were called the Keokuk Rapids down there on the Mississippi, and they described Calvin McVeigh doing flip-flaps, and I had to go to a dictionary of terms that no longer are used. Calvin McVeigh was doing Ozzie Smith long before Ozzie was even born, so it was kind of interesting finding that out. But of the 9 chapters devoted to characters, which one did you learn the most about that you weren't aware of? Probably, you've got a lifetime of knowledge about these guys. So
yeah, that would be one of the names that Jan had in her introduction, Ernie Orsatti, the stunt.
Do you want to share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, I will. Ernie Orsatti was born in Los Angeles and was the gentleman she mentioned that was in the movies first. He was a stuntman in the during silent pictures in the 20s, and working specifically for the Buster Keaton film studio. And what I did in that chapter is I told a lot about Buster Keaton as well. There's a lot more on him obviously in the record than there is on Orsatti. But having read 2 or 3 Keaton biographies, Orsatti almost never gets a name. You go to an index, you might see 1 page. And this is shocking to me because he wound up being a long-time Major League Baseball player. And he worked on 2 of the big films. 2 of the biggest Buster Keaton films. One of them was Sherlock Jr., which is one of the AFI Top 100 comedy films in the 1990 century, end of the century list. And it should be recognized that Keaton was an extraordinary baseball fan. He made it part of everything he did. He made it part of their artistic mission, really, to play ball. At his studio, if there was somebody caught on an idea, if everybody was caught on where we were going to go, let's go out to the ball field. And so he would ask everybody who came in, can you act? What can you do with the movies? And can you play ball? And he was such a big baseball fan that a lot of guys who had already played in the majors, guys like Turkey Mike Dunlin, who I know you all know from the 1905 New York Giants, Turkey Mike, and anyway, these guys were they joined his studio because he really saw these athleticism of these guys and their passion and things like that central to what he was trying to do. He was really a movie person who wanted to be a ball player, and Orsatti, as it turned out, was a guy with more talent as a ball player. He was about Keaton's size, very small, like 5'8", 140. That's why he wound up being his stand-in on the set, a couple of these pictures. Sometimes you'll see in the record that he was a stuntman because he had worked as a stuntman. That he did stunts for Keaton. That's not true because Keaton did his own stunts. But essentially, you wound up with this long record of a Keaton studio, a long record, 10, 15 years, whatever it was in its heyday, that had a lot of ball players connected to it, but almost always trading in on their name already developed as a ball player. They were drinking buddies of Buster Keaton. Orsatti was actually a guy who was working as stuntman and started playing in these studio games. Like, these are like backyard games. But because Buster Keaton was also part owner of one of the minor league clubs in Los Angeles at the time, in the old Pacific Coast League, that the Iowa Cubs are now still in that league, the descendant of that league anyway. He basically signed him up for a team, and it was Turkey Mike who said, "You should be playing ball." And I do have a scorecard from a semi-pro game that I don't know how I found it, from the late 20s, that has Orsatti's name, playing for Santa Monica Bay Merchants, just a team of local businesses that he played on it. And from that, he was signed by Branch Rickey and the Cardinals. The Cardinals in those days had not only, the most minor league teams. It was Branch Rickey who developed the vertically integrated minor league system. Prior to that, you weren't allowed to own major and minor league teams together. He was the one that put together the idea that these would be feeder systems. So the Cardinals had the first, and as a result, the most extensive minor league system. And so he was signed up to one of those teams, went through Cedar Rapids, as a matter of fact, did play 1 year in Cedar Rapids. But the Cardinals in those days had, they owned entire leagues of teams, not just minor league teams themselves. And Orsatti was a product of that. So he's also a good stand-in for that era, but a very unique story. And I don't think anyone else. He was the only one who, as I phrase it, he swam upstream. Everybody else was kind of trading in on their name, but he was the only one to graduate from the studio to the big leagues.
The first chapter deals with Cool Papa Bell, and I had the honor years ago of sitting in Buck O'Neill's basement in Kansas City, and this is shortly after the Ken Burns series came out, and interviewing Buck for 2 hours. His wife brought lemonade and so on. Memorable time, and I taped the whole thing. But he told some great stories about Cool Papa Bell, and you retell some of those in your first chapter. Read the first chapter first, because it kind of gives you a sense for what the whole book is about. And you'll want to go back, but you want to share a couple Cool Papa Bell?
I think the most common
He's fast.
myth about him was that he could, or the line was, and Satchel Paige was, as he called his rooming buddy, and for at least a period of time in their professional careers. And the story has an actual basis in fact, but the line always was, he was so fast he could turn off the lights and get in bed before the room got dark. But it turns out there was truth to that, because they had stayed in a hotel that had a 3-second short on the switch. But baseball is one of those games that has, the reason, you mentioned this earlier, the reason that other sports don't seem to have these personalities, I think they do have them, at least historically they do, but we don't get to know about it because of the pace of the game, the number of contests that take place. Football is closer to boxing in many ways. With every game is an event. Football fans, we don't have baseball widows, because we have football widows, right? I couldn't watch a baseball game in my house every day. That would be the rudest thing I could do. But instead, you breathe it. Instead, it's a religion, John. It has daily affirmation. No other sport has daily affirmation, and that's why it's more like a religion. So, but it loans itself to interesting characters. Time to breathe. That's why this pitch clock it could work, but it's got me really worried. It's got me losing sleep. Right? Because it's gonna impact the pace of our lives. Maybe we can sit back and enjoy it, but I feel like if the players are relaxed and I'm invested in the players, I'm gonna struggle with it as well. My heart rate's gonna struggle.
Yeah. The other Cool Papa Bell story, and Chris tells this one as well, and it's a great story. How fast was he? He hit a line drive up the middle towards second base, and it hit him as he was sliding into second. And that's fast. Are there other personalities that you'd like to share with the group and that came up? Maybe again, surprising to you in terms of what you found out about them?
Yeah, the personality or person that I learned the most about, I guess, was this Helene Robeson Britton. the club owner for 6 years during the teens, essentially. Helene inherited the Cardinals in 1911, 12, right there, I forget, from her uncle, who had inherited it from his brother, Helene's father. So it had been in the Robeson family since before the turn of the century. And she grew up in Ohio, in Cleveland, where the family was from. People of wealth, obviously, they owned a ball club, a couple ball clubs at one time. But she went to all the games. She shot pool with her father, did all these things that in petticoats and things that you couldn't do at that time. And she, when both these men unexpectedly died within a couple years of each other, she inherited the Cardinals. And so she is the first female owner of any in any of the North American professional sports leagues. And she had, and she's forgotten in a horrific way, just in the sense that it's amazing that she doesn't come up more often, I think, in conversation. The Cardinals did not have a terrific amount of success during the 6 years she owned the club, and she was married for a period of time, and so the other 7 ownership groups in the National League at the time wanted him to be the face of the franchise. People should not be led to believe that this is a sport run by women. And she really had to do all this, but she would represent the Cardinals at the owners' meetings in New York annually. She also was not someone who took control of every aspect of the ownership group. She wasn't a loud personality, and I think to be remembered over time, a lot of the big business titans are whatever the ones we remember, but she was also doing what owners are supposed to be doing. Let the scouts do the scouting, let the manager do the managing. Her absence of ego, I think, sort of kept her out of the being better remembered. But she was an owner during an extraordinarily important time when the Cardinals were claiming the city of St. Louis in attendance. Neither club was winning, but the Cardinals, she believed in, she had the first ladies' day in the ballpark, and really believed in setting up a ballpark atmosphere that was conducive to what we now know as baseball being. Prior to that, it was a lot of rowdyism, all the ball games, drinking to say the least. I said in the book there was a club in Cincinnati near the ballpark of the fans, it was called at the time, just a few blocks away, called the 10-minute club. And if you didn't order a new drink in 10 minutes, you gotta go. So that was the kind of atmosphere, and people were rolling dice in the ballparks and so forth. So she was really owner during a time when that really changed. And Rogers Hornsby, the first great Cardinal star, who came about late in that decade, and wound up finally delivering St. Louis the first world championship for either one of their franchises after half a century in the new century. She was very important. There was a lot of pressure on her to trade this great young star who was only 17 or 18 years and could have got 5 or 6 players from him, and she refused to do it despite a lot of pressure. And then the ownership group that included Branch Rickey wound up buying the club from her, and one of his lieutenants was a gentleman named Bill DeWitt, who is the father of the gentleman who is still now the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals, Bill DeWitt, since 1996. And but I think because they didn't win prior to 20, and now they're a very prideful organization with a lot of championships, the team doesn't really celebrate that era prior to that first championship. But she's part of it, and a very important one.
Earlier you mentioned native-born Jerry Downs of Neola, and in your introduction you do talk about the Iowa connection, both with the Cardinals and with the Browns. Can you mention some of the players, including Michael Waka pitches for Boston now, and he's born in Iowa City and so on. But over 40 native-born Iowans have come through either the Cardinal system or the Brown system over the years. And I think you mentioned just a couple of them, if you wanted to, just touch on those.
Michael Waka recently was not raised in Iowa. Neither was
Texas,
Joe McGrain. Both of those men started World Series games for the Cardinals that were born in the state. Joe McGrain in Des Moines. Waddy Holm was the third baseman.
Tell the story about Waddy
Well,
Holm.
I don't know the story so much, except that his life ended abruptly and sadly with a murder-suicide here. But he was wearing it happened in Iowa. You may know the town. It escapes me. But he was wearing his 1926 Cardinals World Series ring.
There were two native-born Iowans in that 26 World Series, and Waddy was one of them. He does appear in the 1933 Gaudy baseball cards and so on, but he ended up, having a mental breakdown, and he killed his wife and then shot himself. And one of the ironies about the hobby is that one of the most sought-after autographs of any former Cardinal is Waddy Holmes, because he just didn't sign. And even though he's a tragic figure and so on, but and there were a couple of others I mentioned. You touched on. Bing Miller played for the Browns, and he's the Iowan that was really good for 15 years that no one's ever heard of. He's from Vinton, Iowa, and had a long career with the Browns and so on. In almost every category, top 10 Iowans in almost every category. Bing Miller's in the top 5 or 6, and then Severide, Hank Severide from Story City, had a great career as a catcher. He's from Story City and played for about 15 years. But he does touch on these, and I'm glad to see that. There were guys from Iowa that had very short careers. There was a Jesse Cyclone Jim Duryea from Osage, played in the 1800s and so on, the late 1800s. And he does appear on some old Judge baseball cards. And then there was a fellow named Clay Carroll from Clays Grove, Iowa, which no longer exists, but it's down by Lee County. And but he mentions a lot of the names. I'm just pleased to see that, even in the introduction.
I want to mention Bing Miller a little bit, because that Benton, that's from I want to mention some Benton County people came in, and so I wanted to talk about a little bit where I'm from, because we have quite a terrific baseball tradition there. Bing Miller was with the Browns. He's from Benton and got his nickname Bing from a comic strip that appeared in the Benton Eagle, apparently. And my grandfather claimed him as a shirt-tail relative of ours. His name was Miller, ours is Moeller, and he was a neighbor in that sense.
Close enough.
But yeah, the final season you mentioned, and I think you were headed towards this before. The final season is the story of Norway High School in its last season before it consolidated with Benton Community Van Horn. The movie was in 2007, I believe. And that's my school. That was the time. It took place. Their final season was in 1991. So that was my school, but not Norway. We were the school they were consolidating with. And so our school board is portrayed as the heavies in that movie. And there was a superintendent. The real gentleman's name, very nice gentleman, as I knew as a kid. His name was Harold Merchant. And the character's name in the movie, but he's a real SOB, is Harvey Makepeace or something like that. It's very unfair. It's a fun movie. It's a terrific movie. And those are my buddies. The guys who didn't graduate with the 91, I was a sophomore when their championship season took place. So the students who did not graduate became my teammates and made me a bench player for the remainder of my high school.
John, wait, one more question.
All right. Questions? Anybody? Take a question from anyone out there? We've been talking a long time. Anybody else want to ask Chris about his wonderful book? Anyone?
What would be your 11th chapter? What did you leave out?
That's a great question. I have a couple letters. I just didn't think I could handle it. It was too much. I have a couple letters that were written by a pitcher in the 40s named Max Lanier, who pitched on some very good Cardinals World Series teams during the war era. He wound up, in those days, the players were not paid well at all in the major leagues. No union, and no freedom over anything they could do, really. It's a legal monopoly in Major League Baseball, it still is, the only sport that is. He took the money and went to the Mexican League, and as a result was banned from baseball. It was supposed to be a lifetime ban. They wound up lifting it over some negotiation to raise salaries and so forth. But he wound up being blacklisted from baseball for going down there. And I have some letters that he wrote that I found they were written as an old man in the 90s. That he had written to, I don't know who this gentleman is, it's to Frank, it's to Steve, it's whoever it is, but kind of explaining what he had done. And I would have loved to have tackled this idea of the Mexican League in that era, and the labor, on early labor unrest at that time before the union, but I didn't know how I could get my arms around it. So, and 10 was such a good round number. So that one got left out, but that was one of my favorite artifacts that I thought, and actually part of the reason, probably genesis of starting the book was the idea to make that one of the key artifacts, but I chickened out. So I want to thank everybody for coming. This is real nice. In the words of 25-year St. Louis resident Yogi Berra, I want to thank you all for coming out and making this night necessary.
Sale, and I know that Chris would be glad to sign them. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And again,
Thank you,
tell your
Jan.
friends
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jan.
It's on Facebook, and they can watch it if they weren't able to come tonight.